Financial leadership is changing. CFOs no longer record history. They make history. This podcast will help you become a better leader, strategic thinker, and digital visionary. Welcome to Secrets of Rockstar CFOs, the ultimate podcast for chief financial officers. Follow along as Jack McCullough engages in exciting chats with accomplished CFOs, learning how they overcame obstacles and positioned their companies for the future. Here's your host, Jack McCullough.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs. My name's Jack McCullough, and I'm your host. You can follow us online at rockstarcfos.com. We have a fantastic guest today, and I'm really excited for this one. Ann Anthony is the CFO of Oberon Fuels. Oberon Fuels produces renewable, clean-burning fuel from organic waste, decarbonizing liquefied petroleum gas and enabling sustainable energy solutions. Ann, welcome to the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs.
Great to be here, Jack.
Well, I've been excited for it, but I will have to admit I wasn't familiar with your company before you and I met recently. And I kind of did my best with the description, but maybe you can fill in the blanks a little bit and let our listeners know a little more about your company, because it's a great story.
Sure, I'd love to. So Oberon Fuels has been around since about 2010 and recently has focused on producing renewable dimethyl ether, DME. But if we zoom out a little bit, basically we specialize in taking waste from hard to abate sectors and basically using chemical processes, transform those into decarbonized portable molecules, renewable natural gas, renewable methanol, renewable dimethyl ether. And these can be blended into other fuels for use in transportation. They can be used as feedstocks for, perhaps biodiesel or SAF, and also can be used really in other chemical processes. Anything you can use natural gas for, you can use renewable natural gas for. So, basically trying to decarbonize the world one molecule at a time.
That's fascinating. So the science is fantastic. So before we get into your career path, I'd like to talk a little about your formative years. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, a little suburb south of Philadelphia. And I grew up as an only child, although I was a second marriage baby. My dad had been married previously. His first wife had passed away. He had 3 sons with her who were older. And my dad was a child of immigrants, as was my mom. My dad did not finish 8th grade. My mom barely finished high school. And I guess I was kind of the precocious child. I was the only girl. The other children were sons. And they weren't quite sure what to do with me. So I went to school early. And, I think I went to kindergarten when I was like 3 or something. Started early, graduated early. I went to high school when I was 12. And I guess I grew up in a very entrepreneurial household, right? My dad owned his own business. I wasn't used to seeing, I'll call it the 9 to 5, right? Where dad leaves with a briefcase every day. He was working in and out of the house, always talking about the interactions he had, building his business and with his customers. So I kind of grew up with that as my frame of reference. I also, I guess, grew up in a household where women went to college to find husbands, not necessarily to make a career. And I guess I knew fairly early on that I wanted more than that, right? I'm married. I love being married. I have children, but that was not necessarily the end goal for me. So I started at Fordham up in the Bronx, and unfortunately my dad got sick during my freshman year, transferred to St. Joe's, finished close to home in Philadelphia. The hawk will never die. And was fortunate enough to, kind of start off in a career that led me to where I am today. I started in a management training program with a company, ICI Americas, that's since been acquired. But had an opportunity to start a little early, worked in treasury, and then went through a number of, I'll just call them accounting focused segments over the next 2 years, and learned a lot about myself. Like, what do I like to do versus, what's interesting to me versus what do I never want to do again? And kind of went from there.
Yeah, sometimes that never want to do again thing is the more valuable lesson than what you
Mhm.
do actually want to do.
Yeah.
So, but I'm curious, did you study business right away, and did you know at a relatively young age?
Yeah. So yeah, I kind of knew from the get-go that I wanted to focus on some type of business. Math and numbers were always interesting to me. So finance, I think, was kind of where I wanted to focus. When I was at Fordham, I took an accounting class, and I'll never forget after the first exam, and I think I got like a 70 on this exam, which I had never gotten a grade like that over my entire academic career. The teacher came to me and said, "Oh, that's a great grade. You should think about, studying accounting." And I was horrified. I was like, "What are you talking about? This is not a good grade." And he's like, "Oh no, you had the top grade in the class. You should see the kids that got 35s." Which again, I was like, "No, I'm going to stick to finance from here." But it's, I prefer to make the history as opposed to record it.
Yeah, that's the tagline of this podcast.
Okay.
CFOs no longer record history; they make it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wow, so cool. So that's interesting. So it sounds like you probably graduated high school then when you were 16,
I was
perhaps
16.
even
Yeah.
15. Okay,
Mhm.
so
16.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yep. And
but
went to school in New York, which, in hindsight, as a parent who's seen my kids go off to college, I'm not sure how I would have felt about that. But yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, so you've had a really interesting career. You've been in the energy sector about not quite 2 decades. Am I fair to say that? I know you were in a tech company prior to.
Yeah, so my first true foray into energy was in 2008 when I joined South Jersey Industries. And prior to that, I had worked in retail, in pharma, in manufacturing, and the last manufacturing role, the company ended up being sold, and I found myself out of a job again because of something that was totally out of my control. And I saw an opportunity at South Jersey Industries. It was a little bit of a step back, but I thought, a utility that should be fairly safe. And little did I know, this was right before the financial crisis. I joined SJI September 2nd, 2008. And of course, 2 weeks later, the world kind of started to melt down. But it was a fascinating time because it really opened the door in many ways for growth at utilities around this country, in ways that people didn't necessarily think of. And what I mean by that is, the New Jersey governor called all the businesses and said, "How do we make sure people can work? How do we spur, investment and opportunity within the state?" And this was happening all around the country. And a lot of the utilities said, "Well, we need to replace infrastructure. It's expensive to do that. You've only allowed us to do this via rate cases previously. Is there a way that we can accelerate that investment, make our systems more safe, which only benefits the public, and we can put people to work? We can put the construction crews back to work." And so this just kind of unleashed, a huge movement, and again, across the country, not just in New Jersey, in the form of a tracker. So utility companies began to invest the money, recover that money more quickly than they would have normally. Again, tremendous growth at the utility. SJI also owned a number of non-regulated energy businesses, so non-utility businesses, but all energy related. And we saw tremendous growth there as well. Solar, we didn't do wind, but there was solar, there were landfill gas to electricity projects, all things that, ultimately were spurred by this, focus on renewable energy. And during that time, I was part of a team that grew. My talents were recognized. I grew along with it. I started as a general manager. I was promoted ultimately to treasurer and to VP of the holding company, and some other roles along the way. And, it culminated, I guess, with a tremendous amount of capital raising. I've raised roughly $9 billion in my career, probably half of it at SJI over those 11 years. But also, a focus on M&A. We acquired a company during that time where we doubled our size, literally overnight with the close of the acquisition, doubled the number of customers, doubled the number of employees. So, again, very transformative for the organization. And I had a great time, and I learned a lot while I was there.
That's interesting at SJI. And then, what I find, and we'll explore this a little bit further, is even though you worked with several energy companies, they're all such unique experiences along the way. And so you went from SJI to Key Capture Energy, KCE, which was a PE funded company. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be great if you could share a little about that experience.
I guess I had the opportunity to leave SJI and join Key Capture Energy, a utility scale battery storage startup. And the mandate was, can you get me sold? They were PE funded. And, again, on this amazing growth trajectory, two founders who were super smart and knew the battery space probably better than anybody at the time. And the PE firm that we were with, we probably had about a year's worth of runway left. But more importantly, I think there was a recognition on both sides that from a technology perspective, we needed assistance. Trying to identify, are there other technologies besides lithium ion? Who's the best integrator to work with, right? How do you evaluate a battery cell partner? Things like that. How do you get financing? So, it rolled up my sleeves and went from the large organization with lots of support into one that was just kind of scrappy and filled with smart people who also wanted to roll up their sleeves and get the job done. And ultimately, Key Capture was sold to SK Innovation in December of 2021. So that was a successful outcome for them.
Well, that sounds like a amazing run, and I'm shocked to hear that you raised $9 billion, because I used to brag that I raised $150 million in my career. So that's a staggering amount of money for me to raise. But I'd like to also talk about Opal, which again is another one, certainly a kind of a once in a lifetime experience.
I guess while I was at Key Capture, I was kind of tapped on the shoulder by some banker friends. And they said, you know what, you should talk to these guys over at Opal Fuels. They want to go public. And they want someone who's, been in natural gas, check, who's worked in a public company and feels very comfortable around, public company processes and controls, check, and who's raised a ton of capital, check. So, met with that team, and this was during COVID, so everything was done virtually. But joined them and literally jumped right into, how do we go public as a SPAC? They had made that decision that they wanted to go as a SPAC, and it made sense for this organization. But there was a lot of work to be done. Obviously, working with the investment bankers to kind of get the story told. But bigger picture, Opal was formed by putting together 3 existing portfolio companies of Fortistar, their parent. And there was a lot of redundancy in the back office that, hadn't really been addressed. And so how do you think about taking, existing resources and creating an accounting team, a finance team for what will be a public company in a couple of months, right? How do you identify talent? How do you figure out where the holes are? Obviously, there was no, SEC talent right on board. You don't need that in a private company. How do you put the rigor into the financial closing processes? Because if you're private, and you miss your deadline, it's okay, you'll get yelled at, but there's really no bigger issue with that. But you can't call the SEC, right? We know this, and say, "Oh, sorry, I'm going to be late." You file.
They don't have a sense of humor about such things.
No, they do not. So again, how do you instill these things in a team while you're trying to go through kind of the bigger process? So it was a fascinating journey. It was a lot of hard work. But, a part of my career that I'm thankful to have had, again, I'd raised a ton of capital, but never from the get-go. And so that was what was really attractive to me about that opportunity. And, was there. We had transitioned to a public company. We were dealing with public company things, right? You have to put processes in place now do earnings calls and do your forecast and have confidence in what you're telling the street and, all of those things, which again, I had done a lot of that when I was at SJI. But many folks on the management team, this was new for them.
The situation with Opal, I thought, was interesting because an IPO, it's fundamentally a financial transaction, the biggest one any company will ever go through in most cases. But it also has an impact on culture.
Yes.
And you mentioned, not so much upskilling the team, but changing the skills that they needed to be at a public company and then merging all of the companies into one. And if I can get a feel, what was the cultural change of the company during what sounds to me like a relatively short period of time?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And culture starts at the top. And so it was an interesting transition, I think, in many, many ways. Opal, as a public company, you need a board structure in place. And previously they had quote unquote board meetings, but it was really, the chairman of Fortistar and a handful of employees. And so now to bring on independent folks into the boardroom and, to have a regular meeting cadence, to do all of the public company governance, it's a change. People need to get used to it. All of the rules and requirements around disclosure. There were lots of conversations around, well, I don't want to disclose that. And, well, it's not Ann telling you to do this. This is what has to be done. The rules say we have to do this. And so, crafting the language that ultimately people get comfortable with. And right over time, things get easier. It's just always the first time. The first anything is always hard because it's change. So there was that aspect of it. And then, I talked a little bit about introducing rigor into the process. That was probably the hardest part of the conversation with the accounting team. People want to come in every day and do their job and they want to do it well. I fundamentally believe that. But what doing it well means changes over time. And so getting people to, go on this journey, because again, it was change. It was going to require them to not only change how they worked, but maybe what they worked on, given some of the moves that we made on the team. And in some cases, I need you to go get additional skills and we're going to figure out how we're going to do that. Or we're going to bring new people onto the team that have different skills that don't exist here. It's all change. And so it required, I think, a lot of, communication around what was happening to the extent that we could share it, because sometimes you can't always talk about this. But I had made a commitment to these folks from when I got there that I would be as transparent to this team as I could along the way. And I would share as much as I could. And if I couldn't, I would tell them that. And I was lucky that I was able to get people to buy in to what we were doing and why it was important to do that work early on. And I think this is just, one of the lessons that I've learned over my career. If people understand what you're trying to do, they're more willing to go on the journey with you as opposed to just telling them, do this.
Yeah. And, being transparent, that gets people who don't agree with you to follow you anyway, right? If they, hey, she's a straight shooter. I don't agree with this, but I trust her and I respect her and we're going to follow. So it makes all the difference. So you've had a great run to this point. And then Oberon Fuels came a-calling. And I'd love to understand, what that process is like joining them. Perhaps it's obvious, but, what was it about the opportunity that you were attracted to?
Sure. So, again, female CFO in energy, I was getting phone calls, all the time and about opportunities. And, most of what I was hearing was just honestly more of what I was already doing at Opal. And I wasn't, why would I leave Opal to go do the same thing? That just didn't make any sense to me. But I was attracted to the opportunity at Oberon for a number of reasons. I had the opportunity to learn about kind of what they were doing. And I thought it was interesting, decarbonizing very hard to abate sectors, and making, taking a waste product and making something that is of productive use. And oh, by the way, we're making money at it and it's great for the environment. Like these are all win-win-wins. But also the opportunity to join early and build with an eye towards either, an IPO or a larger sale to a strategic in a couple of years, and being able to kind of build and lay the groundwork that would enable that, call it growth and scale over the next couple of years. My mandate was clear in the sense of, we need to go raise capital, right? We need to get capital raised to build out, at that time it was one project with a development pipeline. Now we're at 2 projects with a development pipeline, but really be part of the team to help progress those. I was part of a larger, hiring process. In addition to myself, we hired a COO who came out of the industry as well. Again, kind of been there, done that. A VP of engineering, been there, done that. And then, a VP of project development who'd kind of been there and done that. So I felt very good about the people I was sitting around the table with. And these are projects that, at the end of the day, with fully contracted offtake, et cetera, these are infrastructure money all day long. And I was confident in my ability to raise money to get this done. But again, I like to build. I like to problem solve, and I just thought this is kind of the perfect opportunity to do that. We are fully remote as a company.
Oh, really?
So that adds a level of complexity in the sense of joining a brand new team. And lots of new people starting at the same time, how do you build those bridges and kind of build relationships with intentionality? And fortunately, we were able to spend a little bit of time in person with some very targeted kind of processes to kind of get to a place where we gelled as a team.
Yeah, it was interesting because when prepping for this, Google searched you, as you might guess. And it was the first time I'd seen 4 executives join the company at the same time. In the press release, it was noted. So that's interesting. So I always like to explore the relationship between the CFO and the CEO. In your case, Dr. Rebecca Boudreau. Just, for one thing, it's such a critical partnership. For years, CFOs have been saying it's the most important relationship that they have. But in the last 2 or 3 years, CEOs have been saying the same thing. Their most important strategic partner, it's not the VP of sales, and it's not necessarily the top scientific person, engineer or whatever. It's the chief financial officer. So what is your relationship with Dr. Boudreau?
So Rebecca and I have a great relationship. We play off each other very, very well. I hesitate to say that we're at the place where we can finish each other's sentences, but we're getting there. And again, she was very clear in her vision. But she was also I could tell she was comfortable in her own skin. And for me, that's important because I'm a straight shooter and I'm comfortable in my skin. And so sometimes when you have to have really challenging conversations, regardless of whether it's, a personal thing or a work thing, right? Those conversations tend to go a lot better when people appreciate where you're coming from. It's not meant to be a personal attack or, anything like that. And unfortunately, sometimes, I've seen along my career, not always, directly working for them, but even just looking up, sometimes some big egos that get in the way. And I'm very fortunate, I think, in that, Rebecca and I kind of leave the ego at the tour bus door. We get to work. And actually, that's really the case for everybody on the Oberon team. You roll up your sleeves, you do what needs to be done. We have those tough conversations. We have the good ones too. Yeah. But we all feel confident, I think, in saying what needs to be said.
Interesting. And you mentioned earlier the fact that, being a female CFO in the energy space, and it's still, even though it's 2025, it's CEO, CFO pairing in almost any industry is relatively rare. It sounds like it might be extraordinarily rare in your space, but does that, are there any dynamics at play at that, or is that kind of a non-event? Because it's interesting to have 2 women running a company that's so male dominated. Yeah.
I mean, it's, I have to admit, again, when I got that phone call and I heard it was a female CEO, I was like, okay, this could be interesting. But, honestly, once I kind of got past that first meeting, that really became a non-event for me. truly. It really is all about, how do we work together? How do we grow this? How do we scale it?
Yeah, as well it should be. But I still think just because it's so rare that it's an interesting topic for sure. So you've had some great runs with all sorts of different types of companies. And, which probably gives you, if not unique, then certainly a very rare philosophy on what it takes to build a high performance team, not only, in the world of finance and accounting, but across an entire enterprise. And so I'd love to ask you a little about that. What do you look for when you're building a team to, because you're sort of a transformative figure at the companies you've worked at. So,
yeah. So I am definitely not afraid to hire people smarter than I am. I know what I know, and I know what I'm good at. I know also what I'm not good at, or maybe where I just don't feel like I have the strength that is needed to really, bring it home. And so, I constantly look at, okay, what is, if I'm starting from scratch, what are the key components on the team that I need to hire for? And if I don't have anybody, then probably where I would have to start would be on the accounting and control side. So it would either be, VP of accounting, a controller, whatever. And I want that person to be, kind of top notch inside and out from a technical accounting perspective. I know enough to be dangerous on the accounting side, but from the technical accounting and the documentation perspective, I can read it, I can edit it, but please don't ask me to write it. Right. So that's probably where I would start. And then I would layer in somebody with FP&A, et cetera. FP&A is something that I'm probably a little more comfortable with, along with treasury. That's kind of where I grew up in my career, with raising money, and also, like, again, looking forward, forecasting. Again, I would be focused there. The thing that I look for, obviously technical competence is important, but I look for somebody who, can you solve a problem, right? Are you intellectually curious? Do you want to know not only what this thing is, but how does that thing impact this, that, or the other? Can you connect the dots, I guess, is maybe what I'm trying to say a little more eloquently, as opposed to, okay, here it is. Because nothing in business or life is, here it is. There's always, another element to it. In our role, I really believe that, okay, yes, we have to prepare the numbers. They have to be correct. But we also, as a partner to the business, have to be helping people look around the corner. It's our job to kind of parse the information and try to find whatever nugget of information is there that can help us figure out the next thing, so we can continue to kind of, again, drive and grow the business. Or if something's going wrong, figure out, what are we seeing here so we can course correct. So again, I want people who, have that kind of just innate, whatever ability to question and look at it a little differently. Don't just accept what, the numbers are what the numbers are. No, what if it's this instead? Think about it a little differently.
Yeah, I love what you said about, hiring people smarter than you. I mean, in my case, it would be difficult for me not to do that. But I heard a saying, it was one of the previous guests, they mentioned A players hire A plus players, and B players hire C players.
Yeah.
And the point was, the best leaders, they're looking for people that, are smart as them. And, as CFO, why not bring in a VP of finance who's smart enough to do my job? Because, if I stay here, it'll make me more effective.
Exactly.
And, and you really don't want a person who's just going to follow your instructions, even if they don't make sense. So,
right. And honestly, I want the team to look good. And because if the team looks good, I look good. If somebody on the team is not carrying the water, we all look bad. Right. I really am a believer, live together, die together. So, again, so to your point, you want those people who are better than you are to lift up.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It makes all the sense in the world. So I'm going to apologize in advance for my next question, but I am legally required to ask you about generative AI as a host of a podcast focused on CFOs. But I know, this is an area that you've developed a lot of expertise and you're very curious about, and you're using it, to your firm's competitive advantage. But, how does Gen AI change the world for startups as they sort of map their future for their organizations. What's your philosophy on using it, and what are some of the ways that, you're going to keep using it? And what are some of maybe the concerns you have too as a financial leader?
So it's interesting, right? It's a double-edged sword. As a startup, you're typically short on funds, you're short on people, you're short on tech, right? So, you look at AI and you say, okay, well, maybe this can help me bridge the gap. And it's in every tool that we use at this point, just kind of by default. The double-edged sword, though, there is, you need to be a little cognizant of, as you're signing up for various software in the license agreement, have you explicitly given permission to that tool to now train on your data? Because if there are trade secrets that just, it's in a Word document, right? I want to make sure that those trade secrets are protected. And so there's become a little bit of a conversation, within Oberon about, how should we be thinking about AI? And again, it's kind of embedded in everything. It's in Zoom now. You can record a meeting just like we're doing today. As you think about, various meetings that you have as a leadership team, do you want those meetings recorded? Are you going to be talking about things or sharing information that you don't want a record of for whatever reason? So it just comes back to, just be mindful kind of, how are you using the tool? What information are you sharing? Is this something that, if it got out into the public domain would cause us harm? So just trying to level set that. And we had actually put in a policy and training, last year, on that for the Oberon team. So, that'll continue to get refined as AI continues to develop. But I look at it and say, potentially, I think it's an opportunity for us because I don't have a ton of legacy systems to deal with. Our technology is bare bones. And so as we think about kind of what that next generation of technology looks like for us, I'm hopeful that, AI is probably a component of it, and that'll help me, continue to build out the team with an eye towards working smarter, right? Not necessarily hiring, fewer people, but maybe I'm hiring different people onto the team. People that are more analytical and that some of the repetitive stuff can just kind of get handled. And then also I think is if we look at it from an operations perspective, right? We're operating a facility in Brawley, California, where we make renewable dimethyl ether. That facility has been operating for a number of years. So there's data there now that, from an AI perspective, we should be able to use in a predictive way that'll help us identify, yields or the tweaks to processes, a maintenance perspective. If you think about, when stuff happens in the facility and you have to replace a part, all of that's tracked. So is there an opportunity now to get smarter about how we think about plant operations? Huge opportunity.
Yeah, it's sort of the biggest opportunity and the biggest threat too, right? And it's sort of that's why CFOs have to balance it and then perhaps not pursuing it as aggressively as other members of the C-suite. When I talk to CFOs a lot of times, their first reaction is cybersecurity threats, data privacy type of threat.
Oh, yeah.
And, perhaps a VP of marketing, that's, not that they're blasé about it, but it's probably not a top of mind issue.
Right. They're not thinking about that. Yeah.
So, but, if you give away all your customers' credit cards or something like that, that's
a problem.
Good. So, but another big role of CFOs that I think is underappreciated is sort of their role as a risk mitigator. And again, being a novice, to be kind about my knowledge about your own industry, I'm guessing that perhaps you guys have more risks that CFOs face than some other industries. But, how do you approach risk mitigation in your role as CFO?
So, again, as a startup, we're doing a lot of firsts, right? We're contracting for offtake for, a project that we're trying to build. And so as you think about an offtake contract and all of the potential what ifs that can happen there. If it's a take or pay contract and I can't fulfill my end of the bargain, what does that mean? So it becomes the proverbial decision tree as you think about what level of risk is acceptable for a business like this. Okay, if I'm willing to take that risk, how do I offset that risk, elsewhere? So I don't end up with a ton of, death by a thousand paper cuts, a ton of risks, that tiny little risks that on their own would honestly not matter. But if you think about how they could potentially all cascade, and in a, worst case scenario, they all end up happening, in a similar time frame, that could be catastrophic for a business. It's interesting too, because, I've worked in larger organizations. Other folks on the team have worked in larger organizations. We're balanced with a couple of folks who they've grown up in Oberon, right? So they by default have kind of a smaller view of the world. But just, again, having those conversations around, well, what would this mean to us, right? As an organization, how would we deal with it? And then, again, what would it mean from a financial perspective, a reputational perspective, an operational perspective? Just trying to kind of hash through all of that is a fascinating exercise to go through, and then to document all of those risks. It's always interesting, again, when you have someone who's lived in a larger organization and you read a contract, you have to make sure that you've kind of put yourself in the right frame of mind. Something that would have been an appropriate risk at one of my prior employers, potentially is not an appropriate risk for Oberon Fuels at its stage today. So again, just making sure that you're thinking through with clarity, what does that mean? And again, as a team, do we have a plan, a way to kind of work through it?
So, no, that's great. And it's, like I said, it's a bit of an underrated thing, but I'd love to ask a little about Oberon. And you told me before we started that it was named after one of the moons of Saturn.
No, Uranus.
I'm sorry.
Uranus.
No,
yeah.
You said Uranus. Yeah. I wrote down Uranus, and I said Saturn, but
I guess when the founders were trying to figure out how to name the company, they were focused on a planet that produced a lot of methane, a gassy planet. And that would be Uranus. And so there are 26 moons. So this, presents lots of opportunities to name projects. So every entity, every project within Oberon is named after one of the moons of Uranus, and not coincidentally or not coincidentally, I don't know. They also tend to be Shakespeare characters as well. So
the moons of Uranus are named for Shakespearean characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow, I never knew that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I remember, early in my career, I would name things after like the places on a Monopoly board or something like that.
Yeah.
I think your team's a little more of an intellectual than the.
So it's funny because, one of our feedstocks is manure. And if you had told me when I joined Oberon that probably one of the most used emojis, on our Slack channel is the poo emoji, I would not have believed it. But it gets used a lot.
I can only imagine that it would. Well, there was a fun little detour, but mm-hmm. I am curious, what are some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing your company over the next couple of years? Because it seems like you might be at a bit of an inflection point right now, given the relatively recency that you brought in this world-class executive team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, from a challenge perspective, and I think this is not unique to Oberon, right? Any company, I think, kind of where we are, always faces that, how do we scale? How do we make sure that we're not over hiring, right? Because we've seen plenty of companies that have raised a ton of capital go out, they hire a ton of people, and then they sit there and they burn their cash, and they just hired too early, or they didn't hire the right people. And that's kind of a separate conversation. But, one of the things that I had talked about with Rebecca when I joined, and we've really tried to institute this, is milestone-based hiring. What is the trigger that justifies adding this headcount? And so as we think about, trying to get these two projects to FID, financial investment decision, and then starting construction, when should we hire the plant manager? When should we then start to hire the operations folks to bring them on board? And, trying to tie it to commercial operations and move back. So COD minus, 6 months or whatever is really how we're looking at it. Adding folks to the engineering team. If we're going to have these 2 projects in construction, but we have, 3 others that we're trying to move through development, through front-end engineering and design, what is the milestone that we need to hit in order to unlock additional engineering hires? So really trying to approach it from that perspective. Obviously, a company like Oberon, again, not unique to us, anybody that's in the renewable energy space or the biofuel space, I think, clearly we'd like we're hoping for some additional clarity given the new administration. There have been some rules, that were finally guidance was issued for some of the PTCs, production tax credits. But I think we're waiting to see ultimately how the Inflation Reduction Act, gets, treated as a result of maybe Tax Cut and Jobs Act getting extended. Do things kind of come out in the wash, right, as part of reconciliation there, things like that. And then, again, a lot of these things are emerging markets. We produce renewable dimethyl ether, which has, a number of end uses for it. You can blend it into propane to lower the carbon intensity. It can be reformed to make hydrogen. And can be transported in, existing infrastructure. So solves a huge problem there. But, is the market for hydrogen, is it actually that robust today? No, it continues to evolve. So, we'll have to wait and see how some of these things kind of play out and just make sure that, again, you just remain nimble enough as an organization that you're ready to take advantage and continue to kind of drive, where you can in the market. As opportunities present themselves.
I think that's great. And, one thing that is a challenge for CFOs, or they're solving it, but it used to almost be strategy and finance, separate buckets. So, but as a CFO, you're probably the only person in your company, unless there was 1 in 100 companies where the CEO used to be a CFO, who's both a strategic thinker and a financial expert. So how do you make sure that the finance and the strategy don't live separately, that they actually support each other and understand the realities of each other?
So, I guess I look at it and say, at the end of the day, it all comes home to roost in the numbers, right? So to keep them separate doesn't make a lot of sense. And I look at it and say, I want to be the strategic partner to the business. So if I'm not part of the strategy conversation, if I don't understand it, or, it's kind of happening elsewhere, and then, we find out about it later, it's a little counterintuitive, right? It feels like you're automatically setting the business up with kind of one hand tied behind its back. I think where it can be a little challenging is pulling the conversation to a place where, strategy can mean lots of things, lots of big ideas. And so how do we kind of take that big idea and ground it in a place where we can get to an actionable plan, right? Take it from just the big idea, this kind of thing in the ether, to, well, how are we going to do it? What does that mean? And what's the time frame to do that, right? Is it a multi-year thing? Is it a 6-month thing? How do you translate the big idea into an actionable plan? Because then, again, finance can support. We said we were going to do this. We're not seeing that in the numbers. Or we said we were going to invest X number of dollars. Looks like we've spent 2X. Are we seeing the results that we anticipated as a result of that investment? That's how you be the partner to the business. Understand the plan, and then try to find the tripwires, if you will, that tell you if you're not going on the right direction, and bring that back to the business. So again, we can together make actionable decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, what are some of your favorite but not obvious KPIs that you use to measure success at your company? Because you aren't a traditional CFO. You mentioned growing up in FP&A and treasury, as opposed to, a lot grew up in controllership. So I'm assuming you're probably a fan of KPIs to get a better understanding of the business.
So honestly, at this point, because we are in growth mode and we're really focused on fundraising to get these 2 projects built, I think, from a KPI perspective, it's burn rate. are we spending faster or slower than what we originally expected to spend? For the operating facility that we have in Brawley, we do focus on, ultimately yield. Is the process, converting as much dimethyl ether as what we expected? We use a particular catalyst to help do that. And so we're focused as well there, are we using more or less catalyst than what we expected? But then, it also comes down to, on capital that's been raised to date, again, are we deploying capital effectively? So we're kind of still in that, early growth mode, where I don't have a roster of typical KPIs that I'd be focused on. Obviously, when these projects get built, there's a whole host that come to mind, around, production and uptime and, versus nameplate capacity and all of that, but we're not there yet.
Makes sense. So one thing that I find admirable about you is you've always found time, and you've got a lot going on as a CFO for, they've all been transformative when you've worked for them, but you've always found time to do philanthropic type work. Mm-hmm. And right now you're on the board of Bancroft, and I'd love to understand a little about your role there and, maybe what attracted you to taking that particular organization on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was fortunate in that I met Tony Pergolin, who is the CEO of Bancroft, through another organization that I'm part of, the Forum of Executive Women. And Tony was looking for board members. It is incredibly hard to get folks to join a not-for-profit board. And she was looking specifically for, folks in New Jersey. I was employed at SJI at the time, but who, could really help, I guess, advance the growth of the organization. Bancroft has been around for, well over 100 years and serves I'll call it a neurodiverse community, folks that perhaps have traumatic brain injury. They may be, autistic or have some other cognitive issue going on. And we serve our individuals through, a combination of school, in-home programs, residential programs, et cetera. And she was really trying to, figure out how do we steer this organization forward. It is, at the end of the day, it relies on, government funding, right? Typically from the state. They were seeing an influx of folks from around the country. If there's no opportunity or facility in your state that can serve your particular need, then your state typically looks elsewhere. And so, they were seeing opportunities to take folks from literally around the country. They had raised public debt. So again, as a not-for-profit organization, but raising, debt in the public markets to fund growth. And so, I really appreciated the mission. You don't understand until you have the opportunity to see firsthand how impactful this can be for families. Families really struggle to find care for these individuals, and it can tear families apart. I mean, just, you don't appreciate it until you have the opportunity to see it firsthand. And I thought the mission was just, admirable. So I'm happy to give my time and, proud to sit on the board with lots of other smart people.
Well, as the father of two autistic adults, I do want to thank you and the organization for doing what you do, because I can attest to the difficulty families have. And, mm-hmm. As you might imagine, I'm a reasonably well-connected person. And, I lived here my whole life. And it's even for me, it's very difficult to get services that mm-hmm. my children need and deserve. So, but I always like to close our episodes with any advice that you might have for the next generation of CFOs, things you've learned over the years that you just love to pass on, and people who are maybe in their first ever CFO role are going to achieve that in the next month or year, that, you'd like them to know to help them be successful.
So I think, I'll answer it two ways, if you don't mind. For people who are early in your career, and I mean, I have to be honest with you, when I was much earlier in my career, people would say to me, "Are you interested in being in the CFO?" And I'd be like, "No." Mm-hmm. No, that's accounting. I don't want to do that. But I think, the role is so much more than that. It's so much more than that. It's just that the accounting piece, the thing that I said up front that I didn't like to do and I didn't want to ever do again, in reality is, not the lion's share of the job if you have the right team, right?
Right.
But, take the opportunity to learn as much as you can, not only about whatever your particular job is, but how it relates to the other jobs around you. There's something to learn in every task that you do, regardless of how repetitive or silly it might seem at the time. There's something to learn there that you can apply to something in the future. And you just kind of have to trust and kind of go with that. For someone who I think is a little closer to the CFO role, I think, it's important to stretch. I was very comfortable raising capital, $9 billion. Like it's, at one point it just seemed like it became kind of fairly rote. So for me, it was important to get out of my comfort zone. And so key capture was getting out of my comfort zone, getting out of a large company and having to, go back to, rolling up your sleeves. I had 2 people who were amazing, but that was my staff. And, getting to kind of, again, stepping back, peeling back the onion, rolling up your sleeves, doing the work, having to raise capital for a company that is, startup stage is very different than one that is a, investment grade utility, been around forever. So it forces you to kind of get out of muscle memory, right? And relearn how to do it. And so I think it's important to figure out a way to challenge yourself, right? Take some experiences or opportunities to do something that is just, a little different, because it forces you to think differently. And sitting in this seat, you have to think differently. You can't just rely on, well, this is how I've always done it. Again, because whether it's a turnaround situation, it's a growth company like I'm in, it's a company where everything is firing on all cylinders. You have to think differently in order to stay ahead. Otherwise, you will fall behind. And somebody else is going to sit in that seat and think differently for you.
Yeah, I think that's some wonderful advice. So, and I know you have a lot going on, really busy with everything you do, but if you have a moment, I'd just love to give you the chance for the final word.
So, I mean, we talked about a lot. I guess the final thing that I will say is I love my job, and hopefully that comes across. And so to me, it really is not a job. It's just what I do. And I hope that, for anybody, that's what you find, because then it really becomes, something you enjoy, and that comes through in your work.
Thank you for listening to this episode. To continue your exploration of this role that focuses on strategy, leadership, finance, and technology, listen to more episodes of the show at rockstarcfos.com. Join this revolution, episode by episode. Push yourself to achieve great things and unlock the best opportunities available to you. CFOs are creating a legacy, and it's time for you to leave your own unique imprint on the world today. That's all for now. See you on the next one.